A blizzard doesn't choose its victims, but someone did. 8 years old, wheelchair, alone behind an abandoned building in the middle of a Colorado whiteout, and not a single adult reported her missing, because no one was looking. The couple who called themselves her family had already driven home, poured themselves dinner, and gone to bed. What they didn't count on was a retired Marine who'd learned to read silence like a battlefield, and a German shepherd who smelled something wrong before any human even turned their head. This is the story of Emma Hale, the child everyone forgot on purpose. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The dog noticed her first. That was the thing Ethan Mercer would turn over in his mind for months afterward. Not the storm, not the security footage, not the paperwork that came later. The dog. Atlas had been walking a standard perimeter loop along the east side of the Silver Ridge Community Center, same as every Tuesday night, same practiced heel and sweep they'd done hundreds of times together. Ethan's breath fogged in short, white bursts. The temperature had dropped 11 degrees in the last 2 hours, and the Weather Service had just pushed a Level 2 blizzard advisory across every phone in Pitkin County. He was already thinking about the drive home, about whether the truck's rear tires had enough traction, about nothing in particular, which is exactly when Atlas stopped. Not the slow hesitation of a dog catching a scent on the wind. This was a full stop. 4 legs planted, head locked toward the service road running along the building's north side. Ethan had worked with Atlas for 6 years, first overseas, then stateside, after they both came home carrying things they didn't talk about. He knew every variation of that dog's body language the way a musician knows chord changes. The difference between curious and cautious, between a squirrel in the brush and something that deserved his full attention. This was the second kind. "What do you got?" Not a question. He said it low, the way he always did, and unclipped the flashlight from his belt. The beam swept across a narrow strip of frozen concrete wedged between the building's rear wall and a rusted chain-link fence. Storage pallets, a collapsed recycling bin, darkness pooling between dumpsters. And then the light caught something pink. He moved before his brain fully processed it. She was sitting in the wheelchair with her hands folded in her lap, coat collar pulled up around her ears, snowflakes accumulating on her shoulders the way they do on something that hasn't moved in a long time. Maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because of how still she held herself. That unnatural stillness that children only develop after they've learned that movement draws attention and attention draws trouble. Her eyes were open. Brown, wide, tracking the flashlight beam with careful precision. Not panicked, not crying, just waiting. "Hey!" Ethan crouched immediately, dropping below her eye level, the way he'd been trained to approach civilians in uncertain situations. Threat reduction through body language. Make yourself smaller, non-confrontational, predictable. "Hey, I see you. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer. Atlas sat beside him, perfectly still, watching her with those pale amber eyes. The dog's ears were forward, alert, but his posture was calm. A deliberate choice on Atlas's part. Ethan would have sworn it. "What's your name?" A long pause, then, "Emma." Barely above the wind. "Emma, I'm Ethan. This is Atlas." He angled the flashlight away from her face, pointed it at the ground between them. "How long have you been out here, Emma?" Another pause. This one longer. Her fingers shifted slightly in her lap. "I don't know." "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, one small motion. He stood slowly, pulled his radio. "Center base, this is Mercer. I've got a juvenile female behind the North Service Road, estimated 8 years old, alone, no apparent injury, exposure risk is high. I need someone to come unlock the east corridor and get me a warming station set up. How copy?" The radio crackled. "Copy that, Ethan. We're on it. Be there in 2. He clipped the radio and looked back at Emma. She was watching him now, actually watching him, her eyes doing that thing he'd seen in too many places, calculating, measuring, deciding whether he was a threat or something else. "Your parents here?" he asked. She looked at the fence. "Foster parents?" Nothing. But her hands tightened in her lap, just for a second. He filed that away and said nothing else. Didn't push, didn't prod. He simply took up a position beside her wheelchair to block the wind, and he waited with her, the same way Atlas was waiting, present, patient, generating warmth, until the door opened and yellow light spilled out from inside. The community center on any other. Tuesday night smelled like gym floor wax and old coffee. Tonight it smelled like wet coats and anxiety. 20 or 30 people had taken shelter from the storm. An elderly couple who'd been cut off from their motel, a family whose minivan slid into a ditch on Route 9, a group of high school kids who'd been smart enough to pull over when the visibility dropped to 30 feet. Volunteers from the local church ran 2 folding tables of sandwiches and cocoa in the main hall. Emergency management had a desk set up near the entrance where a woman named Phyllis was fielding radio traffic and trying to coordinate with county dispatch. Nobody had reported a missing child. Ethan wheeled Emma inside personally, parked her near the closest heater vent, and flagged down one of the church volunteers, a heavy-set woman named Carol, who had that particular no-nonsense warmth of a grandmother who'd survived harder things than a blizzard. "Get her something hot," he said quietly, "and stay with her." Carol didn't ask questions. She produced a blanket from somewhere, a mug of cocoa 5 seconds later, and she pulled a chair close to Emma and started talking about her own granddaughter, easy and unhurried, filling the space with harmless words while the girl thawed. Ethan watched from across the room for a minute, watched the way Emma accepted the blanket but held the mug with both hands without drinking it, watched the way her eyes moved constantly, tracking every adult who came within 10 feet, calculating distance, calculating intent. Every time someone walked too close behind her chair, her shoulders went rigid. That wasn't cold shock. That was practiced survival. He crossed to the volunteer coordinator's table. "I need to pull the exterior camera footage from the north side. Service road, last 4 hours. The coordinator, a thin man named Dave, who ran the center's facilities, frowned. "We've got cameras back there?" "2. One on the northeast corner, one above the loading dock." Ethan had walked this building's security layout his first week on the job. It was habit. Know your terrain. "I need the recordings." Dave disappeared into the back office. Ethan went back to watching Emma. Carol was asking her something. Emma answered with a single word and went back to staring at the floor. But she'd answered. That was something. The footage was low resolution and partially fogged by condensation on the lens housing, but it was enough. At 5:47 p.m., a gray SUV, older model, Chevy, no front plate visible, pulled slowly down the service road and stopped near the loading dock. The driver's door opened. A figure in a dark coat got out, walked to the rear of the vehicle, and lifted a wheelchair from the cargo area. The figure's movements were deliberate, unhurried. They positioned the chair, transferred Emma from the back seat. She didn't struggle, didn't resist, stood on her own for just a moment before she sat. And then the figure leaned close to her, said something. Emma nodded once. The figure got back in the SUV and drove away. At 5:51 p.m., the blizzard advisory became active. At 6:34 p.m., Ethan's flashlight found Emma in the dark. 43 minutes. She'd been sitting in a blizzard for 43 minutes and nobody had come looking. He watched the footage 3 times. The timestamp on the weather advisory was burned into the corner of the screen. Whoever had left her there had known the storm was coming. The timing wasn't coincidence. They hadn't made a mistake, hadn't panicked, hadn't been separated from her in some accident. They had planned this, picked the window between the advisory and the worst of it, picked a location that wasn't visible from the street, left her somewhere she'd be found eventually, but not immediately. Not dead, just misplaced, deniable. He made a copy of the footage on a thumb drive and pocketed it before he said a word to anyone. Back in the main hall, Carol had finally coaxed Emma into drinking the cocoa. Ethan pulled a chair up across from her, elbows on knees, same low-profile posture as before. "Emma, I found a backpack on the rack of your chair. Is it yours?" She nodded. "Can I look inside it?" A pause. "You're going to anyway." He looked at her. She looked back at him, steady and completely without challenge, just stating what she understood to be true about how adults operated. He felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm asking," he said. "That means you can say no." She considered this for a moment like it was a concept she was encountering for the first time. Then she nodded again. The backpack was a cheap purple nylon thing, a school bag, the kind with a cartoon character on it that had half faded from washing. Inside, a change of clothes, a granola bar, a small stuffed dog missing one eye, and at the bottom, 2 pieces of paper. The first was a medical appointment slip. Ethan unfolded it carefully. It was from a pediatric specialist at a clinic in Gunnison. Dated 6 weeks ago, rescheduled twice, a notation in red ink. Parent non-responsive, third attempt. A handwritten note clipped to it in different handwriting. Rescheduled again, per guardian request, next avail. March. It was the first week of February. The second piece of paper was a torn sheet from a notepad. Block letters, pressed hard enough to have torn through in 2 spots. Do not talk to strangers. Do not tell anyone what happens at home. If they ask, say you're fine. He read it twice, folded both pieces and put them in his jacket pocket. Emma was watching him. You didn't write this, he said. No. Who did? She looked at the floor. That's okay, he said. You don't have to tell me right now. She was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking up, they said I was making things up. The teachers. The last ones. Her voice was flat. Not angry, not hurt. Just factual, the way a person sounds when they've stopped expecting anything different. They said kids like me make things up for attention. Kids like me. Ethan let that sit in the air between them for a second. I believe you, he said. She looked up at him then, fast, like a reflex she couldn't control. The involuntary hope of somebody who'd learned not to hope anymore, checking to see if he meant it. He meant it. By 9 p.m., the storm had graduated to level 3. Roads in and out of Silver Ridge were officially closed. County Social Services was unreachable, emergency line rolling to a recording. Phyllis, at the emergency management desk, had finally gotten through to a supervisor who told her to document the child's situation and transfer her to a temporary shelter facility once roads reopened in the morning. There's a licensed emergency placement in Gunnison, the supervisor said over the radio, loud enough that Ethan could hear from 6 feet away. She'll be comfortable. It's protocol. Phyllis wrote it down. Ethan looked at Emma across the room. She was watching Phyllis write, and she'd heard every word because quiet children always do, because they've learned that listening is how you survive. And he saw her face do something complicated, not panic, not tears, something quieter and worse. She'd heard temporary shelter and protocol and mourning, and she'd translated all of it into language she understood. You're not our problem right now. We'll deal with you when it's convenient. He moved to intercept Phyllis before she approached Emma. We can't put a placement in motion tonight with no caseworker confirmed and no legal guardian contact on record, he said, keeping his voice low. We don't even know who has custody of this child. Phyllis frowned. She'll be fine at the... We don't know that. We don't know anything about her situation yet. I've got footage of someone dropping her off during a blizzard with a note in her bag telling her not to talk. That's not a lost kid. That's something else. Ethan, I understand your concern, but this is outside your... I know what it's outside of. His jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to authorize anything. I'm asking you to slow down and not move this child tonight without knowing who she's going to. Phyllis looked at him for a long moment. She was a good woman. He knew that. She was also exhausted and managing 4 different crises simultaneously and working with a phone that kept dropping signal. I'll make some calls, she said finally. He nodded. Thank you. He turned back toward Emma. Her chair was empty. The blanket was still on the seat. The cocoa mug on the floor beside it tipped, brown liquid spreading across the linoleum in a slow, quiet arc. Ethan was already moving before he'd made the conscious decision, already scanning, already running the math. How long since he'd looked at her? 1 minute, maybe 90 seconds. The hall wasn't that big. He hit the east corridor at a jog. Atlas suddenly at his heel, though he hadn't called the dog. Atlas, who had materialized from wherever he'd been lying and fell into step without a word, because Atlas always knew. The fire exit at the end of the corridor was closed, but the gap at the bottom showed outside light. White, moving, blizzard white. The door hadn't latched properly. It was old. It had a slow return spring. Ethan put his shoulder into it and stepped outside into nothing. Wind like a wall. Temperature somewhere south of 5 degrees with the chill. Snow driving horizontal, thick enough that his flashlight beam died 6 feet in front of him, turned back by a million tiny white mirrors. Atlas barked once, sharp, directional, and lunged left. Ethan ran. She couldn't have gotten far. A wheelchair and 6 inches of fresh snow, she'd have been fighting every foot of it. But she'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd rolled down the accessible ramp from the side entrance, followed the fence line, headed away from the building and away from the road. Away from the adults who discussed her in the third person while she sat 3 feet away. Away from temporary shelters and protocol, and the particular kind of helplessness that comes with being 8 years old and understanding exactly how disposable you are. Atlas stopped, barked again, circled adrift at the base of the fence. The wheelchair was on its side, one wheel still spinning. Emma was underneath it. She'd overturned in the dark, hit a hidden curb or a patch of ice. He couldn't tell, and she hadn't been able to right it. She was face down in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, not moving. Ethan got to her in 3 steps, turned her over. Her eyes were closed, her lips had gone a color they shouldn't be, and when he pulled her against his chest, she was shaking so hard he could feel it through his jacket. Emma, Emma, stay with me. She made a sound, small, not words. I've got you. He was already pulling his jacket open, already wrapping it around her, warmth trading itself from his body to hers, while Atlas pressed in close from the other side, 60 pounds of dog and body heat, and that particular steadiness that Atlas carried everywhere, like a second skin. I've got you. You're not going anywhere. He keyed his radio with one hand. Base, this is Mercer. I need medical at the north fence line now. Juvenile female, exposure, possible hypothermia. Move fast. Copy, Ethan. En route. Emma's eyes opened, just slightly, looking up at him through snow. I heard them, she whispered, about the shelter. I know. I don't want to go somewhere new. Her voice was so thin he had to bend close to hear it over the wind. They always say it'll be okay, and it never is. He held her tighter. Atlas made a low sound, something between a whine and a hum, and pressed his forehead against Emma's shoulder. Listen to me. Ethan kept his voice steady, though his heart was somewhere in his throat. You're not going anywhere tonight except back inside that building. You hear me? That's the only thing happening right now. She closed her eyes again. The lights from the building glowed orange through the white. Somewhere inside he could hear running footsteps. He held her in the snow and waited, the way he'd waited in darker places than this, in colder places, in places where waiting was the only weapon he had left. Somewhere behind him, a door banged open and voices called his name through the storm. And somewhere, 40 miles away down a mountain road buried in snow, a gray SUV sat in a driveway with a clean interior and no trace of a little girl, while the people inside went about their evening as though she had never existed. But the footage was already on the thumb drive in Ethan Mercer's pocket, and by morning, someone was going to have to answer for every second of it. They found him on his knees in the snow with the child wrapped inside his jacket and a German shepherd pressed against her like a furnace. And for a moment, nobody moved. The 2 volunteers who'd come running stood in the open doorway with flashlights cutting white arcs through the blizzard, and the scene in front of them didn't fully compute. Not the overturned wheelchair, not the man who was supposed to be a security guard holding an unconscious 8-year-old in the middle of a level 3 storm, like he'd done this before, like he knew exactly how much pressure to apply and where, like his body had made the calculation before his brain caught up. Get a stretcher, Ethan said. Flat. No urgency in his voice, which was its own kind of urgency. And get the heat in the east room turned up as high as it goes. They moved. He carried her inside himself. Didn't wait for the stretcher. Atlas stayed at his flank, close enough that his shoulder kept brushing Ethan's leg with every step. That steady contact the dog had always used to communicate the same thing. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. The East Room was a multi-purpose space used for after-school programs. Crayon drawings still taped to the cinder block walls. A half-finished mural of mountains above the whiteboard. Someone had dragged a cot in from the storage room and Carol was already there, blankets stacked, a first aid kit open on the folding table beside her. Ethan set Emma down carefully and stepped back to give Carol room. Emma's color was wrong, the pale blue undertone around her lips, the way her fingers curled inward. Her core temperature had dropped. Not catastrophically, not yet, but far enough. He checked her pulse himself before Carol could ask. Strong enough, a little fast, which was better than the alternative. He pulled the wet coat off her, got her wrapped in the dry blankets, elevated her feet slightly. Muscle memory from a combat lifesaver course. He'd taken 12 years ago in 29 Palms, California, in a classroom that smelled like dust and hydraulic fluid, a Navy corpsman named Reyes who'd drilled them for 6 hours straight on exactly this because you will not always have a medevac, gentlemen. Sometimes you are the medevac. Carol watched him work and didn't interrupt. Her temperature comes up on its own. She should be okay, he said. If it doesn't in 20 minutes, we push for emergency evac regardless of road conditions. I'll watch her. I know you will. He straightened. Don't let anyone in here without telling me first. Carol looked at him over her glasses. Anyone specific you're worried about? He didn't answer that. He picked up his radio and walked back into the corridor. Phyllis was on the phone when he found her. An actual phone. Cell signal apparently having clawed its way back through the storm long enough for one bar. And she held up a finger when she saw him coming, the universal gesture for wait, which under normal circumstances he would have. He waited anyway. He stood close enough that he could hear the other end of the call, which was how he learned that someone had finally reached the on-call supervisor for the Pitkin County Child Protection Unit, a man named Gerald Holt, and that Gerald Holt was explaining with the particular patience of someone who'd been woken up that the protocol for emergency placements during declared weather events was clearly outlined in Section 7.4 of the County Emergency Management Framework, and that the child would be documented, photographed, and transferred to the Gunnison Emergency Facility as soon as road conditions permitted, which would most likely be sometime before noon tomorrow. Phyllis hung up and looked at Ethan with an expression that said she'd been hoping for a different outcome. They're sending a caseworker in the morning, she said. Which caseworker? He didn't specify. Did you tell him what was in the backpack? A pause. I mentioned there was a note. Did you tell him what the note said? Phyllis pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. Ethan, I understand you're concerned, but this is outside my jurisdiction. I know. He kept his voice level. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. That SUV dropped her off 8 minutes before the blizzard advisory hit. Not after. Before. They knew the storm was coming. They knew when it was coming, and they timed it so she'd be out there long enough to be found, but not so long that... He stopped himself. Chose his next words carefully. The note in her bag wasn't a reminder. It was an instruction. Someone coached that child on what to say if she got picked up. Phyllis was quiet. I've got the footage on a drive, he said. I've got the medical slip showing a specialist who tried to reach her guardians 3 times and got nothing. I've got a kid who flinches when adults walk behind her and apologizes every time she speaks. He let that sit for a second. This isn't a family that got separated in a storm. This is something else. Phyllis looked at the floor, then at him. What do you want me to do, Ethan? I can't override county protocol. I don't have that authority. I'm not asking you to override anything. I'm asking you to put everything I just told you in writing tonight, with timestamps, so that when the caseworker shows up tomorrow morning, there's a documented record that we flagged this as a potential abuse situation before the transfer happened. She thought about it. A real thought, not a performance of consideration. All right, she said. I can do that. Thank you. He turned to go. Ethan. Her voice stopped him. The couple. The foster parents. Do you have any information on them? Not yet. But you're going to look. He didn't answer. He walked back toward the east room. Emma woke up at 11:43 p.m. Ethan knew the exact time because he was sitting in a folding chair 3 feet from her cot when it happened, his notebook open on his knee, going through everything he'd pieced together in the last 6 hours. He'd sent Carol home. She had a husband waiting, bad knees, a long shift already behind her, and taken the watch himself. Atlas was stretched out on the floor between the cot and the door, head on his paws, eyes tracking every sound from the corridor. Emma came awake the way frightened people do, fast, all at once, already sitting up before her eyes were fully open, already scanning the room. Hey. Ethan kept his voice low and didn't move. You're okay. You're still inside. She found him in the dim light. Her breathing slowed marginally. You're the one from before, she said. Yeah. She looked around the room, the crayon drawings, the mural, Atlas on the floor. He didn't leave either, she said, meaning the dog. He doesn't really do that. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked at her hands for a moment. I'm sorry about running. I know that was She stopped, seemed to recalibrate. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for that. The lady at my last school said I have a problem with running away from things. Her voice carried no particular feeling about it, the same flat delivery as before, the way she'd learned to talk about herself like she was describing someone she'd read about. She put it in my file. What do you think? She considered the question seriously, which surprised him. I think I only run when I can tell that staying is going to make things worse. Ethan looked at her, 8 years old. He wrote nothing in his notebook. Can I ask you something? He said. You're going to anyway. I know, but I'm asking. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. Okay. The people who brought you here tonight, how long have you been with them? Since October. She counted silently. 4 months. Before that? A different family in Montrose. A pause. Before that? Another one. He kept his face neutral. The people in October. What are their names? She looked at the floor. I'm not supposed to say their names to strangers. The note in your bag? Yes. Emma. He waited until she looked at him. The note told you not to tell anyone what happens at home. Is there something that happens at home that you'd want to tell someone if you felt safe enough to? Long silence. Atlas shifted on the floor, repositioned his head. They took my medication away, she said finally. The doctor in Gunnison said I needed it. For my legs. There's something wrong with the nerves. She said it without drama, a fact she'd been carrying long enough that it had lost its weight. They said it was too expensive and it made me difficult to manage. She paused. I don't know what that means. Difficult to manage. I asked once and they got really quiet, and then later there was trouble, so I stopped asking. Ethan wrote it down. Every word. The appointment slip I found in your bag, the specialist in Gunnison. Did they take you to any of those appointments? The first one, in November. She pulled at a loose thread on the blanket's edge. After that, they kept saying the road was bad, or they had things to do. I heard them on the phone once, saying the appointment wasn't necessary. Who were they on the phone with? She shook her head. I don't know. I wasn't supposed to be listening. He looked at the medical slip again, at the red notation, parent, non-responsive, third attempt. Whoever had been on the other end of that call, it wasn't the Gunnison clinic making excuses. Someone had been managing the paperwork trail. Someone had known what questions to deflect and which offices to keep at arm's length, and they'd been good enough at it that nobody had escalated until now. I believe you, he said again, because he'd said it once before and watched what it did to her face, and it seemed worth repeating. She looked at him. The same involuntary reflex as before, that fractured, guarded hope. Everyone says that at first. I know. He didn't look away from her. I'm saying it anyway. She held his gaze for a moment longer than he expected. Then she lay back down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and turned her face toward the wall. He sat in the folding chair with his notebook and listened to the storm work itself against the building, and somewhere around 1 a.m. Emma Hale fell back asleep, and Atlas closed his eyes, and Ethan kept writing. By 6 in the morning, the storm had burned itself down to a steady gray snowfall, and the roads were technically passable, which meant the waiting was over and the next problem had arrived. Its name was Detective Sergeant Linda Voss. She came in through the main entrance at 6:40 with a county sheriff's deputy named Torres and a woman from Child Protective Services named Brenda Caraway, who had a rolling briefcase and the look of someone who'd been in this particular kind of situation many times and had long since learned to feel nothing complicated about it. Phyllis met them at the door, handed over her written incident report, 3 pages, time-stamped, exactly what Ethan had asked for, and then Voss made her way back to the east room with Torres and Caraway trailing her. Ethan was in the corridor when they arrived. He'd been there for 20 minutes, which was to say he'd known they were coming before they knocked. Voss was 50 or so, dark hair pulled straight back, a winter jacket with a sheriff's department patch on the shoulder over plain clothes underneath. She had the kind of face that didn't give you a lot to read. Not cold exactly, but conserved, like she'd decided a long time ago that expressions cost something and she wasn't spending them carelessly. You're Mercer. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Security contractor? Community security. I work for the center. She looked at him for a second, taking inventory. He let her. The incident report says you recovered the child from outside during the storm. That's right. And you stayed with her through the night. Yes. You got a reason for that? Someone had to. Torres behind her wrote something on his notepad. Ethan glanced at it briefly, stayed overnight, not family, no official role, and looked back at Voss. The footage is on a thumb drive in my left jacket pocket, he said, along with the medical appointment slip and the note from the backpack. I kept them to preserve chain of custody. Voss raised an eyebrow. Chain of custody? You've done this before. I've done enough to know what matters. She held out her hand. He gave her the drive and the 2 slips of paper, folded, in a small evidence bag he'd found in the first aid kit. Designed for storing medication, but it worked well enough. She looked at the bag for a moment, then at him. Former military? Marine Corps, 6 years active. She nodded, just slightly. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened, but recalibrated. You interviewed the child? I talked with her. I didn't conduct a formal interview. I didn't want to compromise anything before you got here. But she told you things. She told me enough. He kept his voice even. They withheld her medication, a prescribed nerve treatment that a specialist said she needed. They made 3 appointments in Gunnison and took her to one. After that, they stopped returning calls. The note in her bag told her not to tell anyone what happens at home. Caraway, the CPS worker, spoke up for the first time. She had a clipped voice, efficient, the kind that was used to moving through information quickly. Do we have confirmed placement records for this child with the current foster family? That's what I need you to check, Ethan said, because I've been here all night and nobody from that family has called this location, the county emergency line, or local dispatch to report a missing child. Caraway and Voss exchanged a look. That's not necessarily, Caraway started. It's been 13 hours, Ethan said. They left her at 5:47 p.m. It is now 6:51 a.m. If my child was missing in a blizzard for 13 hours and I hadn't called anyone, what would you call that? Silence. Voss looked at him steadily. Mr. Mercer, I appreciate what you did last night. I do. But from this point forward, this is an active investigation, and your role here is as a witness, not an investigator. Are we clear? Clear. I'll need a full written statement before you leave. Already done. He pulled a folded sheet from his other pocket. 4 pages, handwritten, timed, and dated at 15-minute intervals through the night. Every conversation, every observation, every detail from the footage in enough specificity that a prosecutor could work with it. Voss took it without a word, unfolded it, scanned the first half page. Something crossed her face that was almost, not quite, but almost, impressed. You wrote this overnight. I had time. She folded it and put it in her jacket. Go get some coffee, Mr. Mercer. We'll find you when we need you. I didn't get coffee. He got a corner of the main hall where he could see both the east room door and the main entrance, and he sat there with Atlas at his feet and watched the investigation begin. Torres stood outside the east room while Voss and Caraway went in alone. The door stayed closed for 45 minutes. Long enough for a full initial interview, long enough for Caraway to take photographs, long enough for whatever happened in there that Ethan had no authority to observe and would never entirely stop wondering about. When the door opened, Emma came out in the wheelchair with Caraway beside her, and for just a second Emma's eyes went to Ethan across the room. He gave her a small nod. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked forward. Voss came and found him. She's coherent, the detective said, sitting down across from him. She corroborates your account. And then some. A pause. She also told me something she apparently hadn't told you. He waited. The placement paperwork. We ran the names she gave us, the couple, Kevin and Diane Stoller, Silver Ridge address on Mineral Basin Road. Voss looked at her notepad. CPS has no record of a completed placement approval for this child in their home. There's an application on file from August, but it was flagged for incomplete background documentation, and the approval was suspended pending further review. Ethan was quiet. Meaning, Voss continued, they were never legally authorized to have her. Then how did she end up with them? That, Voss said, is what we're going to find out. She looked at him. Someone processed paperwork that wasn't supposed to be processed. Someone in the system moved this child into an unapproved placement, and apparently nobody caught it or nobody looked hard enough to catch it, and Emma Hale has been living with a couple who had no legal right to her for 4 months. She paused, while her specialist was making unanswered phone calls. The window above them rattled in a wind gust. Outside, the gray morning was getting lighter, the snow tapering off, the mountains coming back into view one ridge at a time. "The Stallers," Ethan said. "Do you know where they are?" "We have a patrol unit at the Mineral Basin Road address now." A pause. "The house is occupied. Both vehicles in the driveway. The gray SUV matches the description from your footage." He looked at his hands. "Mr. Mercer." Voss's voice was careful. "I need you to understand something. What you did last night, staying with her, preserving the evidence, the written account, all of it, that's going to matter when this gets to a courtroom. You did the right things, but the Stallers have an attorney." I checked. He was already on record with CPS as their legal contact for the placement application. He's going to argue that whatever happened last night was a miscommunication, a family emergency, a breakdown in coordination during a declared weather event. She stopped. "I'm not saying that's what it was. I'm telling you what's coming so you're not caught flat-footed by it." "The note in the bag." "Their attorney will say it was precautionary, that they're protective parents who coached their foster daughter on stranger danger. She hadn't eaten since lunch yesterday. I found a granola bar in her backpack that she hadn't touched." He looked up. "A kid who's hungry enough doesn't leave food in her bag, unless she's been taught that food is contingent on behavior." Voss wrote it down. "I'll note that in my report." "Caraway, the CPS woman. Does she know about the unapproved placement paperwork yet?" "She's on the phone with her supervisor now." Something tightened around Voss's mouth. "I get the feeling this is going to be an uncomfortable morning for a few people." Ethan said nothing. He looked at the east room door, which was still open, Emma now visible through it in her wheelchair, while a female deputy sat with her in the crayon drawing room with its half-finished mountain mural. Emma was talking. She held her hands in her lap the same way she always did, still and deliberate, but she was talking, and whoever she was talking to was writing things down. Atlas put his chin on Ethan's knee. He put his hand on the dog's head and kept watching. It was 9 a.m. when the first call came in that changed the shape of the investigation, and Ethan only knew about it because he was standing 6 feet from Voss when her phone rang and because she didn't walk away quite fast enough. He caught fragments, a name he didn't recognize, something about a county records access log, who pulled those files and when. A long pause, and then Voss saying very quietly, "Are you certain about that date?" And then she turned and walked to the far corner of the room, and he lost the rest. She came back 5 minutes later. Her face was the same as always, conserved, unreadable, but something behind her eyes had shifted. She sat down across from him again and spent a moment looking at her notepad. "You said you spent last night going through the documentation," she said. "That's right." "The medical appointment slip, did you look at who referred Emma to the Gunnison specialist?" He thought back. "Her school nurse. There was a referral note attached to the appointment slip. I gave it to you with the other documents. The school nurse filed that referral in September, 2 weeks before the Stallers' placement application was submitted." Voss looked at him. "Which means someone knew, before the application was even in, that this child had a medical situation that required specialist care. And they submitted the application anyway. And then the application got flagged for incomplete documentation, and it should have been stopped, and instead," she paused. "Instead, someone at the county level marked it as approved and initiated the transfer." The room was louder now, the morning shift of volunteers starting to arrive, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of a building coming back to life after a long, cold night. Outside, a plow truck was working the main road, its amber light strobing through the windows. "Who marked it as approved?" Ethan said. Voss looked at him for a long moment. "That's what I'm trying to determine, because the access log for the county placement database shows that someone logged into the system using a supervisor-level credential 3 days after the application was flagged and changed the status from pending review to approved. And that supervisor-level account," she said carefully, "has not logged any other activity in the system for 8 months. Ethan let that sit. "A dormant account," he said, "or an account that was used once for this and then went quiet. Someone had access to a supervisor credential and used it to push through a placement for a child with documented medical needs into a home that hadn't been cleared. Voss said nothing. That's not a clerical error, Ethan said. No, Voss agreed. It is not. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it, stood, and moved toward the door at a pace that wasn't quite a run but wanted to be. Ethan looked at his notebook, looked at the East Room, looked at Atlas, who had shifted from the floor to a sitting position beside his chair, ears forward, alert in the way that meant he'd registered a change in the room's energy before Ethan had consciously processed it. Something had broken loose in the case in the last 5 minutes. He could feel it the way you feel a change in wind direction. Not dramatic, not announced, just suddenly present. Voss came back to the doorway and looked at him. The Stallers, she said. Kevin Staller. He's a licensed foster placement coordinator. Ethan went very still. He's been licensed for 6 years, Voss continued. He's placed 11 children in the county system in that time. She paused. We are now in the process of pulling records on all 11. The plow truck outside made another pass. The amber light swept through the windows in a slow, indifferent arc, throwing long shadows across the crayon drawings on the wall. How many of them are still in the system? Ethan said. Voss looked at him steadily. 7. He held her gaze. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ethan Mercer picked up his pen, turned to a fresh page in his notebook, and started writing. 7 children. Ethan wrote it at the top of the fresh page and underlined it twice. Not because he needed the reminder, it was already lodged behind his sternum, like a piece of shrapnel, but because writing things down was how he processed them, had always been how he processed them, a habit from the core, where the after-action report was the only thing standing between what happened and what got remembered correctly. You wrote it down. You wrote it down before the details softened, and the mind started negotiating with itself about what it had actually seen. 7 children currently in the county foster system who had passed through Kevin Staller's hands as a licensed placement coordinator. He didn't know their names, he didn't know their ages or their situations or what the last 4 months of their lives had looked like. He knew one of them, and he knew what her last 4 months had looked like, and that was enough to make his hand press harder against the pen than it needed to. Voss was on the phone again across the room. Torres had stepped outside. He could see the deputy through the window, standing in the cleared strip of pavement near the entrance. Another phone call, his breath making short white bursts in the cold morning air. Caraway had retreated to the far corner with her rolling briefcase open, her laptop out, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard. The building around them had woken up into its ordinary morning noise, but the East Room had gone quiet, and through the open door he could see that Emma was still talking to the female deputy, still holding her hands in her lap, still doing what she'd apparently decided to do, which was tell the truth to people who had finally given her a reason to believe they were listening. He finished his notes, closed the notebook, and stood up. Atlas stood with him. He crossed to the coffee table. Actual coffee now. Someone had set up a proper urn. Poured 2 cups, walked back, set one in front of the empty chair across from his, and sat down again. Old habit. His former platoon sergeant, a man named Gus Delacroix, had told him once that the most important thing you could do in a developing situation was resist the urge to move just because moving felt like action. You don't know enough yet to move in the right direction, Mercer, so you sit still and you gather information until you do. Delacroix had said it in a FOB outside Helmand, sitting in the dust with a cup of terrible coffee, watching satellite imagery scroll on a laptop, and it had been true then and it was true now. He drank his coffee and waited and thought about Kevin Staller, a licensed placement coordinator, 6 years. 11 children moved through the system bearing his professional signature, his credential, his recommendation. A man who knew how the paperwork worked because he was one of the people responsible for making it work, who knew which databases to access and what a supervisor-level approval looked like, and how to make a flagged application look like a cleared one, because he'd spent 6 years watching exactly how those decisions got made and documented, who had a professional relationship with the people who ran the system, people who trusted him, people who didn't look too hard at what he touched because he was one of them, because he had a license and a record and a handshake relationship with half the county office. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he had taken a child with a documented medical condition, removed her from specialist care, and left her in a blizzard. Not in a rage, not in a panic, calmly. deliberately. 8 minutes before the advisory hit. The coffee was hot and slightly bitter, and Ethan drank it slowly and thought about what kind of person planned something like that, and what else a person like that might have planned over 6 years, and what the word 7 might eventually expand into once investigators started pulling the thread. Voss came back at 9:37. She sat down, looked at the untouched second coffee cup, and took it without asking. Ethan didn't comment. "The patrol unit at Mineral Basin Road," she said. "The Stallers were home. Kevin Staller answered the door, invited them in, offered them coffee." A pause. "He reported Emma missing at 9:03 a.m. this morning, after our unit arrived." Ethan looked at her. "He told the deputy that he and his wife realized Emma wasn't in her room sometime around 8:30 and had been about to call it in when the patrol unit knocked." Voss's voice was completely flat. "His story is that they put her to bed last night before the storm got bad, that she must have left the house during the night, and that they had no idea she'd gone to the community center. She was at the community center at 5:47 p.m. The storm warning hit at 5:55. "I know. We have it on camera." "I know. He's saying they put her to bed before the storm." "He is." Voss drank the coffee. "His wife is corroborating it. They have a statement ready, which is interesting because we didn't tell them we were coming, and people who have a statement ready before they know they need one." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "His attorney." "Already called. He'll be at the station by 11. She looked at her notepad. "The attorney's name is Marcus Frey. He's based in Denver. Not a local family lawyer, not a public defender referral. A Denver attorney who somehow has a direct relationship with a licensed foster care coordinator in a mountain town. Denver." Ethan thought about that. That's a long way to drive for a family that's already lawyered up before a child goes missing. "It's a long way," Voss agreed, "unless you retain someone as a precaution before something goes wrong, because you already know it might." They looked at each other for a moment. "The dormant supervisor account," Ethan said. "The one that changed the placement status. Where does it trace?" "That's still being worked. The county IT contractor has to pull the full access log and verify the IP origin. That takes time." She paused. "We flagged it to the state. They're sending someone from the CPS Oversight Division. Should be here by this afternoon. This has gone above county level." "How far above?" "Far enough that I got a call from my lieutenant at 9:15 asking me to brief him personally." She closed her notepad. "Which is the first time that has happened in 11 years. Outside, another plow passed. The morning light was strengthening, pale winter sun finding its way through the thinning cloud cover, bouncing off the new snow with that particular high-altitude brightness that could make a clear Colorado morning feel almost aggressive. "Emma," Ethan said. "What happens to her today?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "Caraway is working on an emergency placement, a vetted facility in Gunnison. She'll be transported this afternoon under CPS supervision." "Vetting takes time. How do we know the Gunnison placement isn't—" "It's a licensed group facility, not an individual home. It's been operational for 12 years, inspected quarterly, no flags. I checked it myself this morning." She looked at him. "I know what you're thinking. The answer is I'm being careful." He nodded. "She asked about you," Voss said. He looked up. "When I came back in the room after my phone call, she asked Caraway where you were." Voss's expression remained professional, but something around the edges of it was doing something different. "Caraway told her you were still in the building." He didn't say anything. She said, "Okay," and went back answering questions. Voss stood. "I wanted you to know that." She walked away. At 10:15, Marcus Frey arrived at the Silver Ridge Community Center, and everything changed. He didn't go to the police station. He came here. That was the first thing wrong with it. The patrol unit at Mineral Basin Road hadn't told the Stallers where Emma was, had simply said the child had been located and was safe. And yet somehow Frey knew to come to the community center rather than the station, which meant someone had told him, or he'd found out through a channel that shouldn't have been open to him. He was mid-50s, compact, expensive coat, the kind of haircut that cost more than Ethan's monthly grocery budget. He came through the main entrance with his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, talking quietly, and he found Caraway before he found anyone else. Ethan watched from his corner. He saw the moment Caraway recognized Frey. A slight stiffening, a recalibration of posture. and he saw the moment Frey produced a document from his briefcase and placed it on the table in front of her. Whatever it was, Caraway read it twice. Then she went to find Voss. Ethan stood up. Atlas moved with him, and they crossed the room on a diagonal that brought them to within 8 feet of Frey without making it obvious that was where they were going. He stopped near the coffee table and poured himself a third cup he didn't need, and he listened. Frey was on the phone again. The medical documentation is in order. She was transferred under valid county protocol. Whatever this security contractor is claiming is a misinterpretation of a chaotic night during a declared emergency, and my clients were in the process of reporting her absence when... A pause. He listened. I understand that, but the placement record will demonstrate... Another pause. Shorter this time. Whatever the person on the other end said made Frey stop moving. He was still for a moment. Then, send it to my email. I'll look at it in the next 10 minutes. He hung up. He looked at his phone for a second. Then he turned and looked directly at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him over the coffee cup. Frey crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet away, at the edge of the comfortable distance, and he looked at Ethan with the particular assessment of a man who was used to taking the measure of problems and deciding how to handle them. You're Mercer, he said. That's right. Marcus Frey. I represent Kevin and Diane Stoller. He didn't offer his hand. I understand you were the one who found Emma last night. I was. And that you spent the night here with her, as her, what would you call it, guardian. I'd call it a person making sure a child was safe. Frey looked at his briefcase, back at Ethan. I want you to understand something. My clients are devastated by what happened last night. They've been awake since they realized Emma wasn't in the house, and they're doing everything in their power to cooperate with the investigation. They called it in at 9:03, Ethan said, after the patrol unit knocked. A pause. They were preparing to call. Sure. Frey's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever you observed last night, whatever conclusions you've drawn, I'd encourage you to let the proper authorities conduct their investigation without... Mr. Frey. Ethan kept his voice level. Conversational, almost. I have a full written statement with Detective Sergeant Voss that covers everything I observed, in sequence, with timestamps. I preserved the physical evidence in a manner consistent with chain of custody requirements. I documented the security footage before it could be overwritten, and I stayed with the child through the night to ensure continuity of care. He tilted his head slightly. Is there something specific about that process you'd like to address? Another pause. Longer this time. You have a background in law enforcement, Frey said. Military. Same discipline. He looked at Ethan with a slight shift in his expression. Not hostile, something more careful than that. My clients have rights in this process, Mr. Mercer. I want to make sure those rights are respected. I want to make sure a child's rights are respected, Ethan said. I suspect we'll find out which one of those turns out to matter more. Frey looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked toward where Voss had appeared in the doorway of the side office, Caraway beside her, the document in Caraway's hand. The document was a motion filed in Pitkin County District Court at 8:47 a.m., roughly an hour before Kevin Stoller had allegedly realized Emma wasn't in her room, requesting emergency reaffirmation of the Stollers' guardianship status. Pending investigation and blocking any transfer of the child to an alternative placement without court approval. The filing had been prepared. Voss showed Ethan the timestamp metadata when he asked, at 6:12 a.m., before the patrol unit arrived at Mineral Basin Road, before Kevin Stoller had supposedly noticed Emma was gone. Voss showed him the document in the side office with the door mostly closed, which was probably slightly outside the boundaries of what she should have done, and both of them knew it, and neither of them mentioned it. He filed this before he knew we were coming, Ethan said. He filed this, Voss said carefully, before he made any attempt to report a missing child. He was never going to report her missing. That's a conclusion I can't reach officially for several more hours. She took the document back. What I can tell you is that this filing complicates the transfer to Gunnison. Frey is arguing that until the court rules on the motion, Emma's placement status is legally ambiguous, and moving her constitutes a violation of his client's rights as her designated foster guardians. He's using the courts to keep her accessible to them. He's using the courts to create delay. Whether the intent behind the delay is what you're suggesting, That's for the investigation to establish. She folded the document. We have a call with a district judge scheduled for 11:30. The state CPS oversight representative will be on the call. I expect the motion to be dismissed, but it's going to take until at least early afternoon. And in the meantime, Emma stays here. In the meantime, Emma stays here. He looked at the floor. Thought about the document filed at 6:12 a.m. Thought about the phone call Frey had made outside. The pause when the person on the other end said something that made him stop moving. The way he'd looked at his phone afterward like he was recalculating. The supervisor account, Ethan said. The one that changed Emma's placement status. What if it wasn't accessed by someone inside the county system? Voss looked at him. Stoller's a licensed coordinator. He's had years of access to the system infrastructure. Years of watching how credentials work and get stored. What if the dormant supervisor account wasn't a county employee at all? What if it was him, an account he'd built access to and kept quiet? Something he could use once and then let go dark? Voss was very still for a moment. That would mean this wasn't a clerical error that he exploited. It would mean he built the mechanism himself in advance before Emma ever came into the picture. Before any of the 11 came into the picture. She held his gaze. I need to make a phone call. She left. Ethan stood in the side office for a moment alone. Atlas sat at the door watching the main room through the gap. Ethan looked at the empty folding chairs, the half-dead plant on the windowsill, the framed community center logo on the wall that someone had hung slightly crooked and nobody had ever fixed. He thought about Stoller, the calm way he'd invited the patrol unit in and offered them coffee, the statement already prepared, the attorney already retained and already moving. A man who'd spent 6 years building infrastructure for something that Ethan still couldn't fully see the shape of. Who'd moved 11 children through that infrastructure and was now standing behind a lawyer and a court filing and the language of rights and process and cooperation, and who was betting that the system he'd learned to manipulate would be slow enough and complicated enough that the damage would be containable. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. At 11:10, 20 minutes before the court call, Frey made his move. He approached Voss directly, Torres present, in the main corridor outside the east room. Ethan was in the main hall, but the corridor door was open, and his hearing had always been good. My clients would like to speak with Emma, Frey said. Voss's voice came back even and immediate. That's not going to happen. She is currently under their guardianship pending the courts. She is currently a minor in protective custody as part of an active investigation into potential child abuse and criminal abandonment. Your clients will have no contact with this child. Detective, I want to be very clear that any interference with my client's access to their foster daughter prior to a court ruling on the guardianship question constitutes Mr. Frey. Voss's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You're welcome to make whatever argument you'd like to the judge at 11:30. Until then, I'd like you to step back from this corridor. A pause. Step back, Torres said. Shorter, harder. The sound of expensive shoes on linoleum, retreating. Ethan looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back at him with those pale amber eyes that had never in 6 years been confused about what kind of situation they were in. Well, the court call lasted 48 minutes. Ethan sat in the main hall and watched the clock and said nothing. And when Voss came out of the office at 12:23, her face was still carefully neutral, but something behind it had a different quality. The particular quality of a person who has just watched something important go the right way. She sat across from him. Motion dismissed, she said. The judge used the words prima facie evidence of endangerment in his ruling. She paused. Emma is being transferred to Gunnison at 2 p.m. under CPS supervision with a county-appointed advocate. The Stollers are under a no-contact order effective immediately. Ethan let out a slow breath. The state oversight rep also flagged the dormant supervisor account issue directly to the Attorney General's office during the call, Voss continued. There will be a parallel investigation into the county placement database, all 11 of Stoller's cases, and the approval chain for each one. She looked at him. This is going to get very large, very fast. How large? I don't know yet. She was quiet for a moment. Frey had no response to the dormant account issue. He asked for a recess, took 5 minutes, came back and said he needed to consult with his client about some aspects of the case that had come to light. That's attorney language for, I've just been told something that changes my understanding of what I'm defending. Stoller told him. Something, not everything probably. She looked at her hands. We'll know more when the AG's office starts pulling records. For now, Frey has gone very quiet, which in my experience means the attorney is currently doing math about the difference between representing a man who made a mistake and representing a man who built a system. The light through the windows had shifted, the afternoon coming on despite the season, the mountains outside taking on that hard, bright definition that high altitude gave them in winter light. Somewhere in the East Room, Emma was probably sitting with Carol again, or the female deputy, or Caraway, doing whatever the last few hours of waiting looked like for an 8-year-old girl who was better at waiting than any child should be. I'd like to say goodbye to her, Ethan said. Before the transfer, if that's possible. Voss looked at him for a moment. I'll ask. She came back 4 minutes later. She's asking if Atlas can come too. The East Room in the afternoon light looked different than it had in the dark. Brighter, smaller, the crayon drawings more visible, the mountain mural showing its unfinished edge where the sky hadn't been painted yet. Emma was in her wheelchair near the window, a county-issue fleece blanket across her lap, a cup of apple juice on the folding table beside her that she hadn't touched. She looked up when Ethan came in with Atlas at heel. He pulled the chair close and sat. Atlas went directly to her side and put his head in her lap, which he had never done with anyone else in the 6 years Ethan had worked with him, and Emma put both hands on the dog's head and didn't say anything for a moment. They told me I'm going somewhere in Gunnison, she said. That's right. Is it good? Detective Voss checked it herself this morning. It's a real place with real staff and they're expecting you. He paused. It's not forever. It's while the investigation moves forward. She nodded, looking at Atlas. What happens to the Stallers? That's for the courts to decide, but there's a lot of evidence and more people are looking at it now than just us. Her hands moved in Atlas's fur, slow and careful, the same deliberate quality she brought to everything. I wasn't the first, she said. Was I? He didn't answer immediately. You don't have to tell me, she said. I could just tell from the way the detective's face looked when she came back from that phone call. He looked at her for a moment. 8 years old, and she read rooms the way he read tactical maps, the way Atlas read scent, constantly, automatically, because in her world information was what stood between you and the next bad thing. You weren't the first, he said, but you may be the reason the last one is last. She was quiet for a moment. Then, will I have to testify? Probably. At some point, there will be people who help you with that part. Okay. She said it the same way she said everything, without drama, without complaint, a person making assessments and adjustments in real time. Then, can I ask you something? Yeah. Why did you stay? She looked at him directly. Last night, after they told you to go home, you could have just left me with the other people. He thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because she deserved a real one, not a prepared one. Because I've been in situations where someone stayed when they didn't have to, he said finally. And I've been in situations where they didn't, and I know the difference it makes. He paused. And because Atlas didn't want to leave. The corner of her mouth moved, that near smile again. She looked down at the dog. He's a good judge. Best I've ever known. A knock at the door. Caraway, with the county-appointed advocate, a soft-spoken woman named June, and behind them a CPS transport vehicle visible through the window pulling into the parking lot, right on schedule. Emma looked at it for a moment, then back at Ethan. Will I see you again? He held her gaze. I'll make sure of it. She nodded once, took a breath, looked at Atlas one more time, pressed her forehead briefly against the top of his head. The dog held perfectly still, patient and warm and present. And then she straightened up, put her hands in her lap, and turned her wheelchair toward the door. She didn't look back, but she squared her shoulders as she went through it, and that was something. That was something Ethan Mercer would remember for a long time. The sight of an 8-year-old girl with nothing but a purple backpack and a stuffed dog with one eye, and 4 months of damage she hadn't earned, rolling forward into the next thing, straight-backed and deliberate, because she had decided somewhere in the last 14 hours that she was going to keep going. The East Room was empty after she left. Just the crayon drawings and the unfinished mural and 2 paper cups and 1 folding chair pulled too close to a cot. Atlas sat beside Ethan, and they both looked at the door for a moment. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't recognize. No name, just a Silver Ridge area code and 6 words. You should ask about the others. He stared at the text for a long moment. 6 words. No name. A local area code that meant nothing. Silver Ridge had maybe 4,000 permanent residents, and half of them shared the same 3 prefixes. The message had been sent at 12:29 p.m., 6 minutes after the court call ended, which meant whoever sent it had been watching the timeline closely enough to know when the ruling came down. You should ask about the others. He didn't respond. He took a screenshot, forwarded it to Voss's number with a single line, "Just received this," and pocketed the phone. Then he stood in the empty East Room for another 10 seconds, looking at the door Emma had gone through, and then he picked up his jacket and walked out. Voss was in the parking lot watching the CPS transport vehicle pull away when he found her. She had her arms crossed against the cold, her breath making short, even bursts, and she didn't turn when he came to stand beside her, but she'd heard him coming. "The text," she said. "You saw it." "Just now." She watched the transport reach the lot exit and turn south toward the Gunnison Road. "Local number." "I don't recognize it." "I'll run it." She finally turned to look at him. "You're Reed." "Someone who knows what we found this morning and wants us to push further. Someone who knows about Stoller's other cases and either can't come forward directly or won't. Inside the system." "That's my guess?" "Someone who's seen something over time and didn't know what to do with it, or was afraid to do anything with it. And now that this is broken open, they want to make sure we don't stop at Emma." Voss looked at the road where the transport had been. "We're not stopping at Emma." "I know, but they don't know that yet." She pulled out her own phone and typed something. "I'm sending the number to County IT and to the AG's liaison. Depending on the carrier, we can have an ID within a few hours." She pocketed the phone. "Come inside, there are people I need you to talk to." The people turned out to be 2 of them. A woman named Sandra Rice from the Colorado Department of Human Services, Office of Children, Youth and Families, who had driven up from Glenwood Springs that morning and had the look of someone who'd been running on coffee and controlled anger since approximately dawn, and a man named Paul Whitehorn from the Attorney General's office, early 40s, quiet in the way that meant he was always calculating something, who had taken over the side office and set up a laptop and 2 phones and a portable document scanner that he'd apparently brought in a case from his car. Ethan sat across from both of them at the folding table that was becoming, for the second time in 12 hours, the center of something larger than the room it occupied. Rice opened. "Mr. Mercer, I've read your written statement in Detective Voss's incident report. I want to go through some of what you observed last night in more detail." "All right. When you first spoke with Emma, before any other authority figure was present, did she say anything about her living situation that you didn't include in the written statement?" He thought about it. "She said they told her she was difficult to manage, in the context of explaining why they'd taken her off her medication." Rice wrote that down. "Did she use that exact phrase? Difficult to manage?" "Yes." "And you understood that as referring to the medication specifically?" "That's how she framed it. She said the medication was too expensive and it made her difficult to manage. She said it like she'd heard the phrase before, like it had been said to her, or in front of her, enough times that she'd absorbed it as fact." He paused. "She wasn't angry about it. She wasn't performing. She was just telling me a thing that was true about her life." Rice and Whitehorn exchanged a look. "The phrase difficult to manage," Whitehorn said, "appears in the Stoller placement notes for 2 of the other children. In both cases, it was used to justify requesting a transfer out of the placement. The children were moved." Ethan held his expression steady. "Moved where?" "Different placements, both within the county system." Whitehorn looked at his laptop. "One of those children is currently in a licensed group facility in Montrose. One is with a family in Crested Butte. Both placements were arranged through Stoller's coordinator network." He paused. "We're attempting to contact both children today." "He moved them when they stopped being compliant," Ethan said, "and kept the ones who were." "That's a characterization I can't confirm at this stage," Whitehorn said, careful. "It's an observation." Ethan looked at him. "Emma told me she'd been in multiple placements before the Stollers. Montrose was one of them." Whitehorn's fingers went to his keyboard. "Do you know the family name?" "She didn't say." He typed something anyway, looked at it, typed something else. Reese leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. When you made the decision to stay with Emma last night, to ignore the radio instruction to leave, to follow her out into the storm. Were you acting on instinct, or were you acting on a specific assessment of risk? He looked at her. Both. Explain the assessment. The timing of the drop-off was precise. The note in the bag wasn't a general reminder. It was a specific instruction covering a specific scenario, being found by adults and questioned. Someone had rehearsed that scenario with her and prepared her for it, which means someone had anticipated that she might be found and questioned, which means someone had considered the possibility that leaving her in a blizzard might result in exactly the kind of investigation we're now conducting and had tried to limit her ability to cooperate with it. He kept his voice even. That's not a family that panicked or made a bad decision in a crisis. That's a family, or at least one member of it, who modeled the situation in advance and took steps to manage the outcome. The note in the bag was part of the plan. Emma being found was part of the plan. What wasn't part of the plan was the footage, the medical slip, and a witness who'd been trained to document things properly. Silence in the room. Rice looked at Whitehorn. Whitehorn was looking at Ethan with the expression of a man reassessing something. You said at least one member, Whitehorn said, meaning you're not certain Diane Stoller was involved in the planning. I have no basis to assess Diane Stoller's role. I've never spoken to her. Everything I observed points to Kevin Stoller specifically. The placement coordinator knowledge, the database access, the attorney retained in advance. He paused. I could be wrong about the division of responsibility. The investigation will sort that out better than I can. Whitehorn nodded slowly. Your military background. What was your MOS? The question landed sideways, not entirely unexpected, but not where Ethan had thought the conversation was going. 1. Intelligence specialist, later cross-trained as a combat tracker with the 2nd Battalion. A pause. How long? 6 years active, 2 deployments, Helmand Province, then Ninawa Governorate. Whitehorn closed his laptop slightly. When you preserved that footage on the thumb drive, when you put the documents in an improvised evidence bag, when you wrote a time-stamped witness account through the night, that's not standard civilian security contractor behavior. No, Ethan said. It's not. Were you anticipating a legal proceeding? I was anticipating that the evidence existed and that if it wasn't preserved correctly, it would be challenged or lost. That's a basic operational principle. Doesn't matter if you're filing an after-action report or building a criminal case. The documentation is what survives when the memory doesn't. Rice put her pen down. Mr. Mercer, in your assessment, and I'm asking for your assessment, not a legal conclusion, how many of Stoller's 11 placements do you believe warrant serious review? He looked at her. All of them. She held his gaze. That's a significant statement. A man who built unauthorized access to a county database, filed a fraudulent approval on a vulnerable child with documented medical needs, coached that child on how to limit her cooperation with investigators, and had an attorney retained before he reported her missing, didn't do all of that for one child. Whatever he was doing, it didn't start with Emma and it wasn't going to end with her. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside in the main hall, someone was vacuuming. The machines drone a steady, completely incongruous backdrop to what was happening in this room. Whitehorn opened his laptop again. We pulled the full access log from the county database at 11 a.m. The dormant supervisor account was accessed on 4 separate occasions over a period of 3 years. Each access resulted in a status change for a different placement application. He turned the laptop so Ethan could see the screen. 4 children. Emma is the most recent. The others were in 2022, 2023, and early 2024. 4 lines on the screen. 4 dates. 4 case numbers. What happened to those 3 children? Ethan said. 2 of them aged out of the system or were transferred to other counties. We're locating them now. Whitehorn paused. The 3rd one, the 2022 case, is listed as a voluntary return to family of origin. Is that confirmed? It was confirmed at the time by the placement coordinator who handled the case. Ethan looked at the screen. Stoller. He sat back. Let that sit. A child who inconveniently existed in the system got documented as voluntarily returned to family, signed off by the same man who'd put them there, and disappeared into a notation in a database that nobody looked at twice because the paperwork was clean and the signature was legitimate and the system trusted its own credentialed people. "Where is that child now?" he said. "We don't know yet." Whitehorn's voice was careful, professionally careful, the kind of careful that meant the answer underneath it was something worse than not knowing. "We have a name and a last known address from 2022, and we have a team working on locating current status. That part of the investigation is being handled as a priority." Ethan didn't say anything. He looked at the laptop screen and at the 4 case numbers and thought about what Voss had said earlier. This is going to get very large, very fast, and understood now that she'd been underestimating it. Voss found him afterward in the main hall, the interview done, Rice and Whitehorn both on their phones in the side office with the door closed. She sat across from him and said nothing for a moment. "They told you about the 2022 case," she said. "Yes. We're treating it as a missing persons situation, state level. It went up to the AG's office an hour ago." She looked at her hands on the table. She had a small scar on her left knuckle that Ethan hadn't noticed before, a faded crescent. "Kevin Stoller has been taken in for formal questioning. His attorney is present. He said approximately 12 words since they sat down, all of them variations of 'I have nothing to say at this time.'" Frey coached him. "Frey is doing his job. She paused. "That's how it works." "What about Diane Stoller?" "Separate interview room, separate attorney. She retained her own counsel this morning, which means she and Kevin are no longer legally aligned, which means she may at some point decide that cooperation is in her interest." Voss looked up. "We'll see." "The text," Ethan said. "The number. Do you have an ID yet?" "Working on it. The carrier is being slow about the warrant." She leaned back. "Rice and Whitehorn want you available this week for follow-up. You're a witness, but you're also—" She seemed to search for the right word. "You're also an asset in terms of what you observed and how you documented it. Whitehorn specifically asked that you remain accessible." "I work community security," Ethan said. "My schedule is flexible." "I know what you do." She looked at him. "Rice asked me about you after the interview. I told her your background." "Okay." "She asked me whether you'd be interested in a consulting role, formal, contracted, through the state review process." He looked at the table. "You don't have to answer now," Voss said. "I know." She stood, paused. "For what it's worth, and I don't say this kind of thing often because I don't think it needs to be said often, what you did last night was right, not just legally, not just procedurally." She picked up her jacket. "You did the right thing when it would have been very easy and completely understandable to do the comfortable thing instead." He didn't answer right away. There was something in him that wanted to deflect it. The old instinct, the military habit of attributing outcomes to training and procedure rather than to something personal. "Atlas deserves the credit," something like that. Instead, he just said, "Thank you." She nodded and walked away. At 3:15 p.m., his phone buzzed again. Same number as before. This time the message was longer. His name is Ryan Cho, 8 years old, placed with a family on the east side of the county in November 2022. Returned to family of origin per Stoller's file. His birth family has been dead for 4 years. Ethan read it 3 times. He went immediately to the side office and knocked once and opened the door. Whitehorn was on the phone. Rice was reading from a printed document. They both looked up. He held out his phone. Whitehorn read the message. His expression didn't change dramatically. A slight tightening, a breath held and released. But he put his own phone down and picked up the second one and dialed a number that he clearly already had memorized. "It's Whitehorn," he said when the call connected. "I need everything you have on a Ryan Cho, 8 years old, last placement Pitkin County, November 2022. Birth family status." A pause. He listened. His jaw tightened. "How long ago was that confirmed?" Another pause. "All right, expand the search radius statewide and get the National Center on the line. I want a full alert package by 5 p.m. He hung up. He looked at Ethan, then at Rice. "Birth family is deceased," he said. "Parents in a vehicle accident, 2020. No known surviving relatives." He set the phone down carefully. The voluntary return notation in Stoller's file was false. The room was quiet. Rice picked up her own phone and walked to the corner of the room, and the conversation she started was quiet and measured and in a tone of voice that Ethan recognized from a different context, the tone of a person initiating a protocol they had trained for and hoped never to use. He looked at Whitehorn. The text. Whoever sent it knew his name. Yes, which means whoever sent it either knew Ryan directly or had access to the case file. Whitehorn looked at him. The number. Do you want to respond to it? Ethan thought about it. Not yet. If they wanted to identify themselves, they would have. They're giving us information without exposure. If I push them before they're ready, they'll go quiet. Whitehorn nodded. Agreed. He picked up his laptop. I'm going to need you to stay available this afternoon. I'm not going anywhere. He wasn't. He walked back to the main hall and sat in his corner. His corner, it had become his corner over the last 16 hours. An atlas settled at his feet, and outside the afternoon light was doing what it did in February in the Rockies, pulling back early, the mountains going dark at the edges first, the sky above them holding the last of the blue. Ryan Cho, 8 years old. Missing since 2022, and documented as returned to a family that didn't exist anymore, signed off by a man who was now sitting in an interview room 12 miles away saying 12 words. At 4:40 p.m., the phone buzzed a third time. Mineral Basin Road, the house, detached garage, left side foundation. You'll need to move fast before Frey files for a property warrant challenge. He forwarded it to Voss before he'd finished reading it. She called him back in 45 seconds. I've got it, she said. I'm getting a unit to the property now. You stay where you are. Voss? You stay where you are, Mercer. Her voice was firm but not unkind. You've done your part. Let us do ours. He stayed where he was. He sat with Atlas, and he turned his phone over in his hands, and he looked at the mountains going dark through the window, and he thought about the phrase, you'll need to move fast, and he thought about what someone plants in a garage foundation and what they're afraid of losing access to if a warrant challenge creates a legal delay. Documents, maybe. Records. The kind of physical backup that a careful man keeps when his digital infrastructure is built on borrowed credentials and manipulated databases. The kind of evidence that doesn't exist in any county system because it was never meant to be found by the county system. 40 minutes later, Voss called back. We're in the garage, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone working to keep it level. There's a locked steel box in the left foundation crawl space. We're getting it open now. He waited. He heard, in the background, the sound of a lock being worked. A pause. Someone saying something he couldn't make out. Then quiet. Ethan. First time she'd used his first name all day. There are files in here, physical files, printed documents, photographs. A longer pause. There are names, a lot of names. Children and contact information and what looks like. I need to get this to the forensics team before I can say more, but it looks like records. An organized record-keeping system. Maintained by Stoller. The handwriting on the tabs matches the signature on the placement files. She paused again. Some of these files go back 8 years. 8 years. 2 before he was even licensed. The infrastructure hadn't started with the license. The license had been the next step in something that already existed. Ryan Cho, he said. There's a file here, yes. Is there an address in it, a current address? The sound of paper moving. A pause that lasted long enough that he stood up from his chair without deciding to, just stood up. There's an address, Voss said. In Montrose. I'm running it now. He waited. It's a residential address, she said. Single-family home. Is Ryan Cho at that address? Another pause, longer than the last one. Voss? I have a unit en route, she said. That's all I can tell you right now. She hung up. He stood in the middle of the Silver Ridge Community Center main hall in the early evening with Atlas at his side and the phone in his hand and the mountains fully dark outside the windows now, and he waited, which was the hardest thing he knew how to do, and also, in his experience, the most necessary. At 5:53 p.m., she texted him 2 words. We found him. He sat back down. He put his hands on his knees and he looked at the floor for a moment and he breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way Delacroix had taught him. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out. The physiological reset that worked whether you were in a bombed-out building in Helmand or a community center in Colorado, because the body didn't know the difference between those kinds of pressure, it only knew the pressure. Atlas put his head on Ethan's knee. He put his hand on the dog and held it there. At 6:07 p.m., a fourth text arrived from the unknown number. "Thank you. I couldn't do it from the inside. I'm sorry it took this long." He looked at it for a long time. Then he typed back for the first time, "Who are you?" The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Someone who should have done this 2 years ago." He set the phone down. On the table beside him, someone had left a copy of that morning's Silver Ridge Gazette, the pre-storm edition, the front-page story about the winter festival and the new library renovation. Local news. The quiet business of a small mountain town living its ordinary life, while something else entirely moved through it, patient and organized and using the system's own weight to stay invisible. Until an 8-year-old girl sat in the snow long enough for a dog to notice her. He folded the paper and looked at the door and thought about what came next. The hearings, the forensic accounting, the interviews and counter motions, and the long grinding machinery of accountability that moved slowly and imperfectly, but did, eventually, move. He thought about Whitehorn in the side office, and Rice and Voss, and what the word consulting meant, and whether he was ready for what that implied. He thought about Emma in the Gunnison facility, sitting in a real bed in a room where nobody had put a note in her bag, telling her to stay quiet. He thought about Ryan Cho. He didn't know Ryan Cho's face or his voice or what the last 3 years had cost him. He knew only a name on a file tab and a residential address in Montrose, and 2 words from Voss at 5:53 p.m., and right now that was enough. That had to be enough, because the rest of it would come in its own time, in its own order, through channels that were now, finally, open and moving. His phone buzzed one more time. Voss. "Forensics is going to be here until midnight. I need you in for a formal debrief at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Bring the notebook." "I will." "Ethan." A pause. "Ryan Cho is okay. He's scared and he's going to need a lot of support, but he's physically okay." He closed his eyes for just a second. "Good. Get some sleep if you can." She hung up. He looked at Atlas. Atlas looked at him with those pale, steady eyes, and the look in them was the same as it always was. Present, patient, already oriented toward whatever came next. "All right," Ethan said quietly. "Let's go home." The drive home took 12 minutes. Ethan knew every turn of it by now. The left, out of the community center lot, the 2-lane through the center of Silver Ridge where the streetlights were still on their winter timer and clicked off at 10 p.m., regardless of whether anyone was out. The long straight stretch past the feed store and the closed gas station. The right onto the unpaved county road that ran along the tree line for half a mile before his driveway appeared on the left. He'd driven it 1,000 times. Tonight it felt different in a way he couldn't have articulated precisely. Not lighter, not heavier, just different. Like a frequency shift in a room that changes the acoustics without changing the room itself. Atlas rode in the back seat the way he always did, chin on the headrest, watching the dark road unspool in the headlights. The cabin was cold. He'd left the heat on low that morning before his shift, which felt like a week ago, and the place had that particular winter cabin smell of wood and dust and something faintly animal that came from Atlas sleeping near the baseboards. He turned the heat up, fed the dog, stood in his kitchen for a minute looking at nothing in particular. There was leftover chili in the refrigerator from 2 nights ago. He ate it cold, standing over the sink, because sitting down felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make. He tried to sleep at 10, managed something adjacent to it, with that flat, lightless rest that the body takes when it's exhausted, but the mind hasn't fully disengaged, the kind where you're aware of the ceiling above you and the sound of the wind outside even when your eyes are closed. Atlas slept on the floor beside the bed, breathing slow and deep, and the sound of it was grounding in the particular way that Atlas had always been grounding. Present, steady, indifferent to abstraction. At 2 a.m. he got up and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and went through everything again. Not because there was something he'd missed, but because this was how his mind processed things, by walking the terrain one more time in the dark, until the map of it was solid enough to trust. Ryan Cho was alive and okay. That was the fact he kept returning to, the one that everything else arranged itself around. A child documented as returned to a family that didn't exist, living at a residential address in Montrose for 3 years. 3 years, which meant someone in Montrose had known he was there, had been housing him, had been part of whatever system Stoller had built, And that part of the investigation was going to take the case somewhere Ethan couldn't see the edges of yet. But Ryan was alive and physically okay. That was the ground. Emma was in Gunnison, scared, probably, tired, but warm and documented, and with an advocate whose job was specifically to make sure she didn't get handed back to something wrong. And Kevin Stoller was in an interview room saying 12 words, which was currently the only smart decision Stoller was making, and it wasn't going to be enough. Ethan closed the notebook at 3:30 and went back to sleep, and this time actually slept. The 8 a.m. debrief was at the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department, a one-story building on the south end of Silver Ridge that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner and had a waiting area with 3 plastic chairs and a bulletin board covered in flyers that hadn't been updated since November. Voss met him at the door. She looked like she'd slept about as well as he had, which was to say not much, but she was put together in the way of someone who'd made a decision about professionalism and was sticking to it regardless of how the morning felt. She had a cup of coffee in each hand and gave him one without preamble. "Whitehorn is already inside," she said. "Rice is on a call. She'll join us in 10, and there's someone else." "Who?" She pushed the door open instead of answering. The conference room was the largest space in the building, which was not large, with a rectangular table that fit 6 people if nobody was particularly broad-shouldered. Whitehorn sat at one end with his laptop, 2 phones, and what appeared to be a genuinely unreasonable amount of printed paper organized into labeled folders. On the wall, someone had taped a printed map of Pitkin County with handwritten notations in 3 colors. The someone else was a man Ethan didn't recognize, mid-50s, civilian clothes, but carrying himself the way people carry themselves when they've spent a long time in a command structure and the posture has become permanent. He stood when Ethan came in, extended a hand. "Special Agent Dennis Kira," he said. "FBI, Denver Field Office, Child Exploitation Unit." Ethan shook his hand, looked at Voss. "The missing persons flag on Ryan Cho triggered a federal notification," Voss said. "Agent Kira drove up this morning. Arrived at 6, Kira confirmed, sitting back down. "I've read your statement and the incident reports. I'd like to go through some of it with you directly." Ethan sat. Put the notebook on the table. "All right." What followed was 3 hours of the most methodical conversation Ethan had participated in since his last formal intelligence debrief in 2018, and that one had been conducted by 2 officers in a windowless room at Camp Pendleton who had the particular energy of people who already knew the answers and were verifying them against his account. Kira had the same energy, not hostile, not skeptical, just precise. He moved through the timeline in sequence, circled back when he wanted more detail, noted specific phrasings, and asked Ethan to confirm them word for word. The pattern that emerged across the 3 hours, assembled from Ethan's account and Whitehorn's database records, and Voss's investigation notes and 2 phone calls Kira made stepping into the corridor, was this. Kevin Stoller had been operating as a placement coordinator for 6 years. In that time, he had moved 11 children through the county foster system. 4 of those children had been placed using the fraudulent supervisor account access. Of those 4, 2 had been transferred out of his direct network into the general system. Those children were located and under review. 1, Emma, had been abandoned during a blizzard in what the AG's office was now characterizing as deliberate criminal endangerment. And 1, Ryan Cho, had been documented as returned to a deceased family and moved to a residential address in Montrose that belonged to a man named Gerald Firth, 58 years old, no prior criminal record, licensed as a foster care resource home in Mesa County. Gerald Firth's license, Kira said, had been approved 3 years ago by a placement coordinator in Mesa County. The placement coordinator's name was Carl Bedell. Carl Bedell had a professional relationship with Kevin Stoller going back 11 years. They had worked in the same regional training cohort when both were completing their licensing requirements. Ethan listened to this unfold across the conference table and did the math that everyone in the room was already doing. Not one man building a private system, but a network, 2 nodes confirmed and the shape of more visible in the negative space around them. The places where the paperwork was clean and the children moved quietly, and nobody looked too hard because the credentials were real and the process appeared legitimate. "How many coordinators in the regional training cohort?" he said. Kira looked at him. 14. "Are you running all 14? "We are running all 14. A pause. "This is now a federal investigation, Mr. Mercer. State lines appear to have been crossed in the movement of at least one child. We're coordinating with 4 field offices. The room was quiet for a moment. Whitehorn was typing. Rice, who had come in 40 minutes into the debrief and taken the corner seat, was looking at the county map on the wall with an expression that was somewhere between professional focus and something she was working to keep from showing. "The person who sent me the text," Ethan said. "Carl Bedell?" "No." Kira looked at his notes. "We identified the number this morning. It belongs to a woman named Patricia Shue. She's a caseworker in the Pitkin County CPS office. She's been with the office for 9 years. She knew Stoller. She worked adjacent to his cases. She never had direct oversight of his placements, but she saw the paperwork. She says she flagged anomalies twice, internally, in 2023 and early 2024. Both times she was told the issues had been reviewed and resolved." Kira paused. "She couldn't prove otherwise. She had concerns and no evidence, and the system told her the concerns were unfounded, and she made a choice to stay inside rather than go above the system, and that choice has cost her a significant amount of sleep over the past 2 years." He set down the folder. "She came in voluntarily at 7 this morning. She's in the next room giving a formal statement." Ethan thought about the text. "I'm sorry it took this long." The apology of someone who had lived with knowing something was wrong and not having enough to act on, and not being sure what acting would cost them, and then watching a blizzard break it open and feeling the relief and the guilt of it simultaneously. "She's not in trouble," Voss said, reading his expression. "She flagged it internally, twice. That's documented. Whatever she carries about the timing, that's hers to work through. But legally, she did what she could with what she had." He nodded. Kira leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I want to talk to you about something separate from the case facts." He folded his hands on the table. "Your handling of this situation, the documentation, the chain of custody, the witness account, the evidence preservation, was, frankly, better than what I see from a significant portion of trained law enforcement in initial response scenarios. Voss tells me you have an intelligence background." "That's right. I spoke with Agent Delacroix this morning." He let that land. Ethan went very still. "Gus Delacroix. He retired from the Corps, did 2 years with the U.S. Marshals, then moved to our Denver office. He's been there 4 years." Kira looked at him. "He speaks highly of you. Said you were one of the best trackers and analysts he worked with. Said the reason you left the Corps was a medical discharge after Ninawa. Shrapnel. Left side, thoracic region. I can function, but I don't qualify for active duty." "That's consistent with what he told me." Kira paused. "He also said you turned down a marshal's offer 3 years ago." Ethan looked at the table. "I wasn't ready." "Are you ready now?" The question sat in the air over the conference table. Whitehorn had stopped typing. Voss was looking at her coffee cup. Rice was looking at Ethan. He didn't answer immediately. He thought about what ready meant and whether he knew, and whether the honest answer was that what he'd felt for the last 24 hours, the focus, the clarity, the sense of each piece connecting to the next, with a logic he understood and could work with, was something that had been missing for 3 years, and he hadn't fully known it was missing until it came back. "I don't know," he said. Kira nodded, like that was a reasonable answer. "Rice and I would like to bring you on as a contracted consultant for the duration of this investigation. The scope is significant: 4 field offices, potentially multiple state agencies, a child network that may involve a substantial number of cases going back years. We need people who can synthesize information, document accurately under pressure, and engage with child witnesses in a way that doesn't compromise testimony." He paused. "You demonstrated all 3 in the last 24 hours without being asked." Ethan looked at him. "I drove community security for a living. I'm aware of what you've been doing." Kira's voice wasn't dismissive. "I'm also aware of what you're capable of, and so are you." A pause. "Think about it. You don't have to decide today, but I'd like an answer before the end of the week." Ethan picked up his coffee cup. It was empty. He set it back down. "I'll think about it," he said. "Mte." He thought about it for approximately 4 days, which was the amount of time it took for 3 other things to happen that made the thinking both easier and more complicated. The first was Kevin Stoller's attorney, Marcus Frey, withdrawing from the case on the 3rd day. No public statement. He simply filed a notice of withdrawal with the court and stopped returning calls, which in Ethan's assessment meant that Frey had looked at what was in the garage crawl space and done the math on what he'd been retained to defend and decided the math didn't work. 2 days after Frey withdrew, Kevin Stoller made a different kind of calculation. The kind that people in his position make when the evidence is comprehensive enough, and the alternative is a trial that would put everything on public record in granular detail. He requested a meeting with the AG's prosecutor. Ethan heard this from Voss on day 4, over the phone, while he was sitting on the porch of his cabin watching Atlas run a pattern through the snow-covered field behind the house, burning off energy the way he did every morning, methodical and self-directed. "He's cooperating?" Ethan said. "He's negotiating," Voss said. "Which is different, but yes. His new attorney, a woman from Colorado Springs, has indicated he's prepared to provide full documentation of the network in exchange for sentencing consideration." How full? Full enough that the AG is taking the meeting seriously. He apparently kept records on everyone, every coordinator in the network, every child moved, every contact, dates and amounts, and she stopped. "Amounts," she said again, and the word carried the particular weight of a thing that hadn't been said clearly until now. Ethan didn't say anything. "There was money involved," Voss said, "in the movement of some of the children, not all of them, from what we can tell so far, but some." A pause. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it became public." He watched Atlas circle back across the field, leaving a clean track in the snow. "How many children are we talking about total, across the network?" "Conservatively, 31. That's confirmed cases. There may be more." He put his free hand flat on the porch railing. The wood was cold through his palm. "Ryan Cho," he said. Ryan was not a financial case. He was, Stoller's notes describe him as a child who was moved because he was, quote, too observant, meaning he asked too many questions and noticed too many things. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone who has processed anger past the point where it shows. He was 8 years old, and they moved him because he was too smart. Ethan stood up from the porch. "Where is he now?" "Gunnison, same facility as Emma." A pause. "They've been introduced. Apparently they had lunch together twice this week." He sat back down. "Well, the second thing that happened was Patricia Shu. She called him directly on day 2. She'd gotten his number from Voss, she said, and she hoped that was all right. And her voice had the careful, braced quality of someone approaching something they'd been rehearsing and still weren't sure how to do. He told her it was fine. "I wanted to say this to you directly," she said. "Not through the investigators. I should have done more, sooner. I knew something was wrong with Stoller's cases and I filed internal flags. And when they told me it was resolved, I accepted that. Because it was easier. Because I had a job and a family. And because these things, when you start pulling on them in a system you work inside of, sometimes the thread comes back to you." A pause. "I don't say that as an excuse. I say it because I want you to understand that I knew, at some level, and I chose not to push hard enough, and that choice had consequences I can't undo." He listened to all of it. "I hear you," he said. "I'm not the right person to absolve you of anything, Patricia. But for what it's worth, you sent the texts. When it mattered, when it was open enough that the information could actually move, you sent them. Ryan Cho is in Gunnison right now, partly because of what you sent." Silence on the line. "Is that enough?" she said. Not asking him. Asking herself. "I don't know," he said, because it was the only honest answer. "But it's something. It counts." She thanked him and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and thought about the different ways a person can know something is wrong and the different thresholds at which they act, and how those thresholds are shaped by things that have nothing to do with courage or cowardice and everything to do with what the system around them has trained them to expect. And he thought about Emma sitting in the snow for 43 minutes, and the people who must have driven past the community center during those 43 minutes without stopping and what their thresholds had been. He didn't come to any conclusions. He rarely did, with that kind of thinking. He just held it for a while and then put it down and went back to work. The third thing was Emma. June, the county-appointed advocate, called him on day 3 with what she described as a request from her client. Emma wanted to know if Ethan and Atlas could visit before the weekend. There were procedures for this. He'd need to go through the facility's visitor approval process, provide documentation, clear a background check, which given the circumstances was completed in about 4 hours rather than the standard week. June called back at 4 p.m. to say he was cleared for a Saturday visit. He drove to Gunnison on a Saturday morning that was clear and cold and relentlessly bright, the kind of February day in the Rockies where the sky is the specific blue that looks like it's been painted on, and the snow on the mountains has a crust of ice that catches the light and sends it back in fragments. Atlas sat in the back and watched the road. The Gunnison Children's Residential Center was a low brick building set back from the main road with a proper parking lot and a fenced yard, and a front entrance with a buzzer and a camera and a staff member named Tom who checked his ID and his documentation and gave Atlas a long look before clearing them both through. The lobby had a mural, children holding hands in a circle, the mountains behind them, the kind of image that had been designed to feel welcoming and managed about half of that, and a reception desk and a hallway that smelled like institutional cleaning product and something baking somewhere in the back of the building. June met him in the lobby. She was a small woman, early 40s, practical haircut, wearing a lanyard with her photo ID and a sweater that was slightly too large for her. She had the energy of someone who'd been doing emotionally demanding work for a long time and had made a considered peace with it. "She's been ready since about 7 this morning," June said. "It's 9 now." "I know." Something in her expression. She set an alarm. He followed her down the hallway to a common room at the end. Tables, chairs, a bookshelf, windows looking out at the fenced yard where the snow was still deep but tracked through with footprints. Emma was at a table near the window in her wheelchair, a book open in front of her that she clearly hadn't been reading, and when he came through the door, she looked up with the same reflexive check she always did. Door, person, assess, and then something in her face did the thing it did, the fractured thing, the reluctant hope that kept showing up despite everything. Atlas walked directly to her. She put both hands on his head and said nothing for a moment, just held the dog's face between her palms, and Atlas stood perfectly still and let himself be held. "Hi," she said, to the dog, then to Ethan. "Hi." "Hi." He sat in the chair across from her. "How's the food?" She considered the question seriously, which he'd come to expect. "The oatmeal is good. The soup is okay. The sandwiches are..." A slight pause. "They're fine." Damned with faint praise. She didn't know the phrase, but she figured out from context and almost smiled. Almost. "How's your cabin?" "Cold. Atlas knocked a cup of water off the kitchen counter last night. I don't know why he does that." She looked at the dog. "He probably wanted attention. He gets plenty of attention. Maybe he wanted more." She scratched Atlas behind one ear, the dog's eyes half closed. They sat like that for a moment. The particular easy quiet of people who'd been through something together and had come out on the other side of needing to perform comfort at each other. "They told me about Ryan," Emma said. She wasn't looking at him when she said it, looking at Atlas. "They said he's here." "Yes. I had lunch with him twice." She was quiet. "He doesn't talk much." "That might change." "I know." She looked up. "He's smart, though. He figured out the TV remote the first day and nobody else had been able to work it." A pause. "I think he was just waiting for someone to let him figure something out." Ethan looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's probably right." June, from across the room where she was giving them space without leaving entirely, turned a page in her folder and said nothing. "Ethan." Emma's voice changed slightly, the careful, factual tone. "What happens next? With the Stallers and everything?" He'd thought about how to answer this, in the car on the way down. He decided that the standard approach, the softened version, the age-appropriate reassurance that didn't quite tell her the whole truth, was wrong for Emma specifically, because Emma had been given softened versions of things for most of her life, and she knew what they felt like, and they didn't help her. "Kevin Staller is cooperating with federal investigators," he said. "He's giving them information about other people who were involved. In exchange, his sentence might be shorter than it would be otherwise, but he is going to prison." She processed this. "What about his wife?" "She's cooperating separately. She's told investigators that she didn't know everything. Whether that's true is something the courts will decide." "Do you think it's true?" He held her gaze. "I think she knew more than she's saying and less than he did. That's my read, but I could be wrong." She nodded. This seemed to satisfy her in the way that honest uncertainty satisfied her more than confident conclusions. What about the other kids? The ones in his cases? There are people working on that. Federal investigators, state investigators, multiple offices. There are at least 30 children whose cases are being reviewed. 30? She said the number quietly. Let it sit. Yes. She looked out the window at the yard. A staff member was pushing a wheelbarrow of snow near the fence, doing some kind of winter maintenance. Steam came off the pile where the sun hit it. I didn't know about any of them, she said. I just thought it was me. I know. It helps, she said carefully, to know it wasn't just me. That sounds like a terrible thing to say. It's not a terrible thing to say. It's honest. She looked at him. Are you going to keep working on it? The investigation? I've been asked to. I haven't decided yet. What would you need to decide? He thought about it. I'd need to know I'm the right person for it, that I'm doing it because it's what I'm actually good at, and not because last week was dramatic, and drama can make you think things are a better fit than they are. She looked at him for a moment with those steady, assessing eyes. You stayed in the snow with me for 45 minutes, she said. That's not dramatic, that's just you. He didn't say anything. Atlas stayed too, she added. So maybe ask him. The dog, at the mention of his name, looked up from where he'd settled his chin on Emma's knee. He's biased, Ethan said. Everyone's biased. She looked at him. But some biases come from knowing someone pretty well. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the staff member finished with the wheelbarrow and went back inside, and the yard was quiet, the snow undisturbed except for the footprint trails and the one cleared path and the place near the fence where the wheelbarrow had been, a shallow track ending in a pile. I'll come back, he said, whatever I decide about the job. That's not connected. She looked at him. Okay. I mean it. I know you do. She said it without the braced quality she used to say things like that, the waiting to be disappointed tone. She just said it. You don't say things you don't mean. I could tell from the first night. He thought about that first night. The snow. The note in the bag. Her hands folded in her lap in the dark, 43 minutes in a blizzard, waiting. Can I ask you something? He said. You're going to anyway. I know, but I'm asking. She almost smiled again. Okay. When you rolled yourself out into the storm, what were you thinking? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, I was thinking that if I was going to be somewhere I didn't want to be, I'd rather choose it myself. A pause. That probably doesn't make sense. It makes sense. I've spent a lot of time going where people put me, she said. I thought, even if outside was worse, at least it was my decision. She looked at her hands. That was stupid. I know that now. It wasn't stupid. It was the logic available to you at the time. She considered this. You're not going to tell me it was dangerous and I shouldn't have done it. You already know that. Everyone else says it anyway. I'm not everyone else. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened slightly in the wheelchair, the same way she'd straightened going through the door of the east room. That squared, deliberate posture that was purely her own, something nobody had taught her, and nobody had managed to take away. I'm going to be okay, she said. I think. I don't know what okay looks like exactly, but I think I can get to it. I think so too. June says I might be able to start at the school here next week. They have a science program. A pause. I like science. I never got to do much of it before because the schools kept changing. What kind of science? I want to understand how things work, she said simply, like the actual mechanisms. Why things do what they do. He nodded. Atlas. She looked at the dog. What makes him the way he is? With people. He came to me right away, both times. Why does he do that? Because he's a good judge of who needs him, Ethan said. Is that training, or is that just him? Both. The training gives him the language. The judgment is just him. She put her hand back on the dog's head and looked at him thoughtfully, with the particular focused attention of someone filing information away for future use. He drove home in the early afternoon with the mountains going gold on the western faces, the way they do at that hour in winter, that last light golden that lasts about 20 minutes and makes every ridge look like something out of a painting nobody would believe was real. Atlas was asleep in the back. The road was empty. The radio was off. He thought about what Emma had said. You don't say things you don't mean. And he thought about what he'd told her, that he'd come back. And he knew with the certainty that he rarely had about things that it was true. Not because of obligation, because Emma Hale was going to grow up, and she was going to need, at various points along that process, someone who answered her questions honestly and showed up when they said they would, and didn't flinch when she was difficult or demanding or scared. And he knew how to do those things, and he was available to do them, and that was enough of a reason. He thought about Kira's offer. He thought about the steel box in the garage crawl space, and the 31 case files, and the network that Stoller was now helping unravel from the inside. And he thought about the other Patricias out there in other county offices who had seen anomalies and filed internal flags and been told everything was fine and had accepted it. And he thought about whether there was a version of this work that could move fast enough to be useful rather than just thorough. He thought about Delacroix. Gus Delacroix, who had drilled him on triage and documentation and the discipline of sitting still until you knew enough to move in the right direction, and who had apparently been watching from a Denver field office and had known his name when Kira asked. By the time he got home, the golden light was gone, and the mountains were dark, and the stars over Silver Ridge were doing what they always did at altitude in February, appearing in a quantity and clarity that people from cities found genuinely startling. The sky so full of them, it looked like something had been spilled. He sat on the porch for 20 minutes with Atlas beside him and looked at the stars, and then he went inside and found Kira's card and texted the number. I'll take the consulting role. When do you need me to start? The reply came in 4 minutes. Monday. Welcome aboard. Delacroix says it's about time. Ethan put the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then he filled Atlas's water bowl, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey that he mostly didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open to a blank page. He wrote 2 words at the top, Ryan Cho. Then below it, after a space, 31 cases confirmed, more probable. Then he started working. 6 weeks later, the Pitkin County Courthouse saw the first of what would eventually be 9 separate hearings across 4 jurisdictions. Kevin Stoller appeared on a Tuesday morning in a gray suit that fit poorly across the shoulders, flanked by his new attorney, and entered a formal cooperation agreement with the AG's office that named 7 additional individuals in the placement network, including Carl Bedell of Mesa County, and 2 individuals outside Colorado whose names entered the federal case file and didn't appear in any public reporting for several months afterward. Diane Stoller entered a separate guilty plea on charges of criminal negligence and willful endangerment of a minor. She received a suspended sentence, probation, and a permanent ban from any foster care or child welfare role. She left the courtroom without looking at her husband. Marcus Frey was never charged with anything. He returned to his Denver practice and presumably went back to his regular clients. And whatever he knew, and when he knew, it went with him into the category of things that couldn't be proven and therefore couldn't be acted on. Ethan thought about this occasionally and then put it down, because some things were like that, and he'd learned over time that holding on to them cost more than it returned. Patricia Shue kept her job. Her internal flags from 2023 and 2024 were entered into the official record, and her supervisors, the ones who had told her the issues were resolved, were placed under administrative review. She sent Ethan a text one evening in March that said, "I sleep better now." He texted back, "Good." She didn't respond to that, which was fine, which was the right amount of contact for what they were to each other. Ryan Cho was placed with a certified therapeutic foster family in Gunnison in early March. He was 9 by then, and at his first meeting with his new family, he didn't say much, but he did sit down at the kitchen table and look at all the objects on it and ask, in a careful, quiet voice, how the toaster worked. His foster mother, a woman named Diane Chen, who had been certified for 7 years and had an engineering background and kept 3 working clocks on the kitchen wall because she liked to know the time, pulled out the toaster, put it on the table, and they looked at it together for 40 minutes. She told this story to the caseworker at Ryan's first placement review, and the caseworker put it in his file, and Ethan read it later as part of the case documentation and felt something that he didn't have a precise name for, but that settled somewhere in the chest and stayed there. Emma Hale's case moved differently. The emergency guardianship that had been the working arrangement since February required a formal court review at 90 days. Ethan had been aware of the timeline. He'd been making himself aware of it since the second week, in the background, the way you keep track of something that matters without making it the center of every conversation. He'd visited the Gunnison facility 4 times by then, 3 with Atlas, once alone when Atlas had a vet appointment he couldn't reschedule. June had been at each visit. Emma had started the science program at the local school and had, according to June's notes, corrected her biology teacher on the mechanism of nerve signal transmission in the second week politely, with a reference to the specialist documentation from her Gunnison medical file, which she had apparently requested a copy of and read. The teacher had, to her credit, looked it up and confirmed Emma was right, and told her so in front of the class. Emma had said, according to June, "Thank you, I just wanted to make sure," and gone back to her worksheet. Ethan sat with his attorney, a woman named Carol Brenner, no relation to the Carol from the community center, who operated out of a small office in Gunnison and had a wall of family law certifications, and the brisk, clear-eyed manner of someone who'd done exactly this kind of work for 20 years and had opinions about every part of it, and went through the paperwork on a Wednesday afternoon in April. "You understand this is a long process," Brenner said. "Emergency guardianship to formal placement to permanent guardianship takes time, even when everything goes smoothly, which in our experience it rarely does entirely." "I understand. There will be home studies, background reviews, interviews with Emma, with you, with anyone in regular contact with either of you. The court will appoint a guardian ad litem separate from her advocate." "I know. Your new employment with the federal contractor will be reviewed. The travel requirements may raise questions. I've already talked to Kira about structuring the consulting work to allow for regional operations. He's amenable." Brenner looked at him over her reading glasses. She had the expression of someone running an assessment. "Mr. Mercer, why do you want to do this?" He held her gaze. It wasn't an unexpected question. He'd asked it of himself enough times by now that the answer had become clear in the way that things become clear after you've turned them over long enough. "Because she needs someone who will show up," he said, "and I will show up. That's the whole answer. It's not complicated, and I don't have a better one." Brenner looked at him for another moment. Then she took off her glasses and set them on the desk. "All right," she said, "let's get started." "What?" It was a Tuesday in May when the formal paperwork was filed, and a Thursday in June when the home study was completed, and a Friday in late July when the court hearing took place in a Gunnison courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county building with pale blue walls and fluorescent lights that hummed slightly, and a judge named Margaret Osei, who had been on the family court bench for 14 years and read every document with the attention of someone who understood that the papers in front of her represented actual children. Emma was present. She sat in her wheelchair to the left of Ethan's chair, June beside her, and she held her hands in her lap the way she always did, still and deliberate. And she looked at Judge Osei when the judge looked at her, and when the judge asked if she understood what was being decided today and whether she wanted to say anything, Emma said yes to the first question and thought about the second one for a moment. "I want to say," she said, in the careful, factual voice, "that I've been in a lot of places, and some of them were okay and some of them weren't. And the difference between okay and not okay, from what I can tell, is whether the person responsible for you treats you like a problem to manage or a person to know." She paused. "Ethan treats me like a person to know. That's what I wanted to say." Judge Osei looked at her for a moment. Then she made a note and looked at the documents in front of her. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Ethan walked out of the courtroom into the hallway with Emma's wheelchair beside him and Atlas at his heel. Atlas had been granted facility access through the court's therapy animal accommodation, a technicality that Brenner had navigated with the calm competence of someone who'd done it before. And the hallway was empty and bright and smelled like floor polish and summer coming through the open window at the end. Emma looked up at him. "So," she said. "So," he said. "Now what?" "Now we go home," he said. "If you want." She looked at the window, at the light coming through it, at Atlas, who was sitting between them with his chin up and his ears forward, pointed at the door to outside the way he always was, always oriented toward the next thing, the next terrain, the next problem to solve, or the next open field to run. "Okay," Emma said, and they went. Not every child who gets left behind gets found in time. Not every person who sees something wrong is brave enough to send the text. Not every storm breaks open the thing that needed to be broken open. But sometimes one dog stops on a routine perimeter walk, and one person trusts that stop, and one child who has learned to hold perfectly still and wait to be forgotten turns out to be the one nobody can afford to forget. Because the truth she carries, once it starts moving, doesn't stop. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen. The bravest ones keep telling the truth until someone finally shows up worth telling it to.